So the BRCA breast cancer genes are fairly well known. They belong to a class of genes known as tumor suppressors. So their abnormality doesn't just affect breast cancer risk, but affects risk of cancer of the pancreas and colon and ovary in women, and cancer of the pancreas and colon in men. And the prevalence isn't really known. I really looked to find out what the prevalence in the broadest population was, but I couldn't find that number because I think it's really very low. But in women with breast cancer, and 1 in 12 women will get breast cancer in their lifetime, it's 3.5 to 6.2% in women with early onset premenopausal breast cancer. The younger the onset, the higher the chance that that's a play. Next. So we know about that gene, but what about genes that may be more common and where the, let's say, the hereditable variations or single nucleotide polymorphisms are more common? So MTHFR stands for methyl tetrahydrofolate reductase, which is a gene that has to do with transfer of methyl groups around the body. And a methyl group is 1 carbon and 3 hydrogens, and it's one of the most common chemical activities as cell transformation, as molecular transformation occurs over and over and over and over again. And so a single nucleotide polymorphism just means that one of the little codons is different than, quote, most of the population. And this one looked at the risk of prostate cancer, and this was interesting to me because the combined variant genotypes of 2 of these codons was associated with a 30% reduction in risk of prostate cancer. Not all bad. And in contrast with other variant genotypes where there is a slightly increased risk of prostate cancer. Next. And this speaks to just this incredible complexity we're approaching, where it looks at the MTHFR SNPs, dietary folate in breast cancer risk. And they found an inverse association in breast cancer risk with folate intake in general, regardless of the genotype, the way the genes look. But certain SNPs showed a significant increase in breast cancer incidence, particularly when folic acid was low. What would be ideal from my perspective is to do genotype testing for a couple big general areas. One is the detoxification profiles, so that you would know who didn't detoxify well and possibly why. And the second is the methylation panel profiles. And the truth is, you can get a detox profile that's decent but not great at a cost of, I think, $500, or I'm sorry, $250 or $300. But the methylation panel you can't get in this state, because our state, in its wisdom, I guess, has decided that somehow the public isn't ready for its own medical information. That test is about $500, but you'd get it once, and you'd kind of have a broad sense of your vulnerabilities in that particular area. There's a zillion others, but at least in that area you would. And then you might look at your toxic burden by taking a careful history mostly, and then by doing appropriate testing to see if it was worth making the effort to go through a intense detox program. But having said that, I'll move on to next. And this is risk for cardiovascular disease, for mortality based on blood levels. It's from NHANES. So this is some of the best science the country produces. It was in Circulation, one of the best medical journals. And they looked at 13,900 adults for 12 years. And they all had blood levels under 10 micrograms per deciliter, which is what is considered, quote, a normal range in the country. And the mean blood levels for all participants was very low, 2.58. And they looked at the prevalence of reduced glomerular filtration rate, which is a marker of kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, cholesterol, hypertension. All of this increased with blood levels even when they were within the normal range. Okay? So even when the levels were under 10 micrograms per deciliter, in, again, the vulnerable host, because some of us can tolerate a much higher lead level than others, there is this tendency to see more of this disease. And postmenopausal women had higher mean blood levels than those who were not postmenopausal. Why? Because when you're young, the lead that gets into our bodies from the atmosphere, etc., sequesters in the bone that's being built and is stored there. And as you get older and postmenopausal and you start to lose bone mass, the lead leaches out, and hence the levels go up. And all the other things that go with getting old happen. Next. So, increase in all-cause cardiovascular deaths was evident at lead levels over 2 micrograms per deciliter in the blood. This isn't a provoke test. This is just a blood test. More than half of us have levels higher than that, I would bet. More than 3/4. 38% of all U.S. adults had lead levels above 2.0. So association of CVD mortality and blood lead persisted after adjusting for these background causes of heart disease risk: declining kidney function, hypertension, C-reactive protein. So lead, it really is, it's an independent risk factor that's never addressed in the common conventional literature, and I'm not sure why. There was no evidence of increased cancer mortality associated with the lead issue. Next. And their analysis from environmental health perspectives, another great journal, sufficient evidence to infer a causal relationship between lead exposure and hypertension. Cross-sectional studies suggesting association between increased lead exposure and decreased heart rate variability, a measure of autonomic nervous system health, at levels lower than 5 micrograms per deciliter. And the cardiovascular endpoints described above, plus the substantial evidence that chronic lead exposure affects cognitive function and renal function at levels less than 5 micrograms per deciliter, indicate that the CDC criteria for elevated blood levels in children of 10 micrograms per deciliter is really too high for adults. And so, take it, I mean, my idea now is if we're going to do preventive medicine in these areas, we're really working hard, and we're so good at lowering cholesterol and getting LDL to a great range. We know now that our goal, triglycerides, should be at 75 or less, and we know now that we want that HDL above 50 in men and higher in women. And we know that if we can achieve those things, we really can very significantly limit the progression of arteriosclerosis, heart disease, and stroke, and the limiting factors that affect us as we age. But this is another issue that's easy to look for, not expensive, and in my mind, very easy to treat. Next. The way lead works is it stimulates the renin-angiotensin system, which is sort of the system that helps, is a very complex neuroendocrine system that regulates blood pressure, and where most of the medicines, many of you are on them, the angiotensin converting enzymes like lisinopril, the angiotensin receptor blockers like Benicar, and the direct renin inhibitors, or the newer ones like Tecturna. Many of you are on them, and they do a great job. But the lead downregulates nitric oxide, which is really the stuff that makes the lining of our arteries most healthy and active and elastic, which is what we want. It decreases glomerular filtration rate, increases oxidative stress, and in general it screws us up. 202 patients with chronic renal disease had a normal total body lead burden and no history of exposure to lead were observed for 24 months. The primary endpoints occurred in need for hemodialysis occurred in 24 patients during the observed period. Serum creatinine levels and body lead burden at baseline were the most important 2 risk factors.